Hello everyone, welcome to the 30th lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. As you know, we are in the last week of this course on Sociology of Development in terms of globalization and development. If you look at the kind of trajectory that we have followed, we have started with the indicators of development, then modernization theory, which was the first sociological account of development. Then we have discussed the critiques of modernization theory. Then we have discussed dependency theory and its critics. Then we have discussed the limits to growth thesis. Then small is beautiful we have discussed. Then we have discussed Toward a History of Needs by Ivan Illich, and in the last class we started discussing paradigms lost, paradigms regained, development studies in the 21st century by Franz J. Surman. What we have discussed in the last class that how until the mid 1980s the post Second World War development thinking said three basic paradigms, namely essentializing the third world and its inhabitants as homogeneous entities. Secondly, the unconditional belief in the concept of progress and in the makeability of society. And thirdly, the importance of the nation state as an analytical frame of reference and a political and scientific confidence in the role of the state to realize that progress. Okay? And these are the paradigms which are losing ground in the wake of risk society, in the wake of civil society, in the wake of the question of diversity, in contradistinction with inequality, in contradistinction with progress, in contradistinction with the state as an analytical frame of reference, not simply in the context of modernization theory, but also in the context of dependency theory. Okay? And we have discussed how development theories from modernization to dependency, as well as the international development aid industry, said these three paradigms. And from the mid 1980s onwards, these three paradigms increasingly lost their hegemonic status and are challenged by a loose set of partly descriptive, partly heuristic notions like civil society, social capital, diversity and risk. And Surman analyzes the most important reasons for the loss of the central paradigms in development thinking and assesses the importance of development studies in general and sociology of development in particular of several postmodern, post-development and globalization inspired notions and insights. Then we have discussed how in development studies how it has made it to the 21st century, and at the same time its object of analysis, object of study, that is social, economic and political inequality with respect to the third world. We have discussed Sachs' anti-modernist non-development via Rehnema's alternative development and post-development to reflexive development by Netherwin Peters, and the shift from theory to paradigm that we have also discussed. And the first two characteristics of the post Second World War development thinking, namely essentializing the third world and its inhabitants as homogeneous entities, and the unconditional belief in the concept of progress and in the makeability of our economy, our culture, our polity. These two characteristics of post Second World War development thinking form the core of the so-called developmentalism. Okay? I mean, everything is reduced to development then. Okay? I mean, that refers to kind of evolutionary development thinking directed at the third world, that was unilinear and teleological, and as such could harbor two apparently contradictory clusters of development theories, namely modernization theories on the one hand and Marxist development theories on the other. Okay. And the third characteristic of post-Second World War development thinking, that is the central role of the state in the development process, was a reflection of how, starting in the 19th century, the modern state increasingly took the initiative in the development process. This initiative reached its highest point, zenith, in the post-Second World War phase of constructing the welfare state in the Western industrial world, an idea which was subsequently exported to the Third World. And as we have discussed, history moves on. Those social, economic and political developments change the way we have moved away from theories to paradigms. We have discussed Kuhnian paradigms in terms of normal science, in terms of revolutionary science. That is why we discussed how normal science, if normal science is a tradition bound activity, then revolutionary science is a tradition shattering activity. Okay? And the three paradigmatic characteristics of the post Second World War development thinking have in time come one by one under attack. Okay? That is how we have discussed the essentialization of the Third World, critique of the idea of a homogeneous Third World, and then we have discussed which is an extension of the critique of dependency theory, which in its most popular version could not explain the diversity of development experiences amongst Third World countries, whether it is from Latin American countries or African countries or Asian countries and so on. And role of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, popularly known as OPEC, in the oil crisis at the beginning of the 1970s, the economic success of the Asian tigers in relation to the continuation of extreme poverty in Africa and the return to military dictatorships in several Latin American countries, which that also has led to political regression where the questions of heterogeneity come under question. They assume greater significance. When I say Asian tigers, I refer to Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan and South Korea. And then we have discussed postmodern critique of essentialism through the works of Foucault and Derrida in particular. Derrida's concept of deconstruction, the way Foucault tried to dwell upon a critique of enlightenment, European enlightenment specifically, critique of modernity, critique of rationality, critique of development, critique of positivism, critique of economism, critique of neutrality, critique of objectivity, critique of science and so on. In order to carry out social research, the social scientists need abstract concepts, but according to the postmodernist critique, these are either projections springing from the subjective mind of the scientists in question or based upon so-called shared experiences of a group of respondents and were deemed unreal and manipulated. And this led to a situation where within the realm of development studies in general and sociology of development in particular, many researchers became hesitant about specifying their domain of activities, studying the inequality in the Third World in order to avoid being accused of essentialism, or else they turned to the vague but relatively safe notion of diversity within Third World experiences. And in turn, that led to the awkward situation that at least at a paradigmatic level, there was a sort of change from an emphasis on inequality to one on diversity, but this never experienced either a further paradigmatic elaboration or the necessary translation towards the level of testable, workable development theory. Then we have discussed the end of the belief in progress, the end of the unconditional belief in the concept of progress and in the machiability of society, That lies the end. I mean, when I say the end of the belief in progress, I mean the end of the belief in socialism. Okay. In the 1990s, the vanishing belief in progress became translated into the growth of various versions of postmodern non-development thinking on the one hand, and the idea of the risk society propounded by Ulrich Beck and others on the other. Development pessimism had already set in because it was realized that the gap between rich and poor countries continued to widen, that where economic growth had occurred, it had a catastrophic effect on the environment, and that the end of real existing socialism and removed socialist inspired development trajectories from the academic and political agendas. Non-development thinking, as Sachs argue, that development talk still pervades not only official declarations but the language of grassroots movements, and it is time to dismantle this mental structure. If grassroots movements wielded a discourse in which they exercised their right to have access to the development process, they were warned off by the authors of the development dictionary led by Sachs, and implicitly accused of having a false consciousness instilled by constant bombardment with the wrong images provided by Western controlled media. And the level of underdevelopment which the authors of the development dictionary led by Wolfgang Sachs traced to the US President, the erstwhile US President Truman in 1949, that led to arrogant interventionism from the north and pathetic self-pity in the south. And the way Sachs suggested that the concept of development is outdated precisely because of its belief in technology that has led and will increasingly lead to ecological disasters. The concept of development was an ideological weapon in the East-West conflict, I mean the conflict between the developed countries and the less developed countries, which is no longer there. There is no more need to find ideological allies in the South on the basis of a project wherein the US provided the role model. The welfare gap between the developed countries on the one hand and less developed countries on the other is growing and not diminishing in spite of the promise of the development discourse. And development leads to a loss of diversity, which is boring, and that's how Sachs tried to look at poverty, production, equality and standard of living. I mean a window of other ways of looking at the world and to get a glimpse of the richness and blessings which survive in non-Western cultures in spite of development. Anti-modernism of Renema are, I mean, relegating progress and development to the dustbin of the 20th century concepts. The Western notion of progress would only cause environmental pollution because it meant industrialization. It would sever indigenous peoples from their cultural roots and expose them as helpless victims of a global exploitative capitalism that, through manipulation in the media, urged them to consume the wrong things for the wrong reasons with money that they did not have. Nevertheless, alternatives put forward by post-development thinkers have a high new age like content clad in third world clothes. Two other variants of the loss in the belief of progress, I mean embodied in the concept of the risk society on the one hand and in the suddenly popular appearance of apocalypse authors on the other. Therein lies the questions of moral consciousness, and in this context Surman, Franz J. Surman tries to look at Huntington's class of civilizations, Hobsbawm's moral crisis, individual materialism, degradation of traditional networks of human solidarity. Such moral vacuum results in a chaos completed by the onslaught of a global economy, leaving nation states virtually defenseless, and Robert Kaplan's The Coming of Anarchy in the context of West Africa that has led to total political and social chaos. And coming to the third paradigm in the post Second World War development thinking that we have discussed in the last class. I mean it refers to globalization that has resulted in the retreat or withdrawal of the state from its basic responsibilities to provide welfare, and the impact of globalization on development studies to realize the importance of the concept of the nation state for social science theories in general, and at least at a paradigmatic level, the nation state also plays a central role within development studies, being an interdisciplinary social science. The importance of the state became visible in modernization theories, dependency theories, and even in world system theories, for example, in the works through the works of Immanuel Wallerstein. And therein lies, the way we see today, there is a greater amount of fragmentation and deglobalization taking place. Decreasing economic, political and cultural importance of nation states, economic, political and military expansion of international political organizations. Culturally, the idea of national identity as the central element in identity formation for individuals or groups is quickly eroding in favor of cosmopolitanism on the one hand, and or the fortification of ethnic, regional and religious identities on the other. And there is a sense of normative orientation that we have discussed. And in today's lecture, what we are going to do, we are going to look at the paradigms regained. We are going to look at what kind of paradigms which are regained. Then the debates, the debate around which we are going to discuss Surman's paradigms regained, okay, is a threefold one. One, diversity versus inequality, progress versus risk management, and state versus civil society. Okay. The same discussion about the dangers of essentializing the object of study took place maybe within gender studies, okay, or maybe Dalit studies, okay, subaltern studies. Okay. Let us look at this one by one. We will start with diversity and diversity versus inequality. When I said the same the way these three paradigms of the post-Second World War development thinking have lost their hegemonic status within development studies, is this something that we must regret? Or should we regret that development studies has moved from a theoretical crisis to a more paradigmatic crisis, which has prodded some to replace development studies by something called global studies? Okay. If I say development studies may be replaced by global studies, okay, the answer depends to a large extent on whether the criticisms were justified in the first place, criticism against those paradigms which are lost, and if so, whether postmodernism, post-development and globalization are capable of offering new exciting paradigms which cater to the explication of development studies. Let us discuss one by one, starting with diversity versus inequality. The paradigm that essentializing the third world and its inhabitants as homogeneous entities, that the first one, Surman tries to look at it from the vantage point of the debate between diversity on the one hand and inequality on the other. The same discussion about the dangers of essentializing the object of study took place within gender studies. It is rather enlightening for development studies to trace that discussion, and gender studies, if you look at, is a branch of social sciences which is akin to development studies for two reasons. One, the explication of gender studies shares with development studies a normative preoccupation with the lack of emancipation of large groups of people. And secondly, gender studies shares with development studies some of the Marxist and non-Marxist or neo-Marxist meta theories, which subsequently became heavily criticized. For example, James Martin in 1994, what happened to gender studies was that the way Martin reflected on this, that in attempting to steer clear of the traps of essentialism, ahistoricity and false generalizations, feminist theories fell into opposite but equally dangerous ones. In over-encompassing for our failure to acknowledge the differences of race, class and ethnicity, we tended a priori to give privileged status to a predetermined set of analytic categories and to affirm the existence of nothing but difference, and in other words, in trying to avoid the pitfall of false unity, we walked straight into the trap of false difference. During the 1980s, feminist researchers increasingly realized, in response to consistent criticism in this respect from feminists in the less developed countries, that talk about women masked difference, and hence that more attention must be dedicated to the differences in the position and experiences of black women, lesbians for example, and so on. However, as Martin notes, the problem then is not that substantial differences within, for example, the category of black women, such as in the Caribbean or Latin America, are not taken into account. But then, if following this line of reasoning, one ends up with a near endless degree of differentiation between women. Martin concludes her lucid article by emphasizing that differentiation and categorization of the target group should be in harmony with the practical and theoretical purposes of the research in question. And as such, Martin emphasizes, however, that social categories used in the research should be sensitive to time, place, context and purpose of the research. And then Stanley and Wise in 1990 develop a similar argument and point out that the fear of academic and political ghettoization and marginalization induced feminist studies to replace the study of women with the study of gender. According to these authors, gender studies is a poor and depoliticized version of feminism, akin to studying race relations rather than racism and colonialism. What Surman thinks here, that the messages which Martin and Stalin and Weiss put across is very relevant for anyone struggling to recover a meaningful domain for development studies. Development studies, like gender studies, has to avoid false generalizations caused by essentialist fallacies, but the answer is not to be found in burying ourselves in the trap of non-essentialism. Gender studies only leads to a depoliticized and a non or anti-emancipatory analysis of sheer endless differences between or within third world countries, according to Surman. Although Surman was very sensitive towards claims that in the past voices from the third world have been silenced by a Eurocentric approach to the development problem, Surman does not have the impression that studying the endless diversity within the less developed countries contributes anything to alleviating poverty, which is experienced and voiced for that matter by so many people in the third world. And in that sense, Surman is not particularly sensitive to criticisms raised against the concept of emancipation, because it happens to be a so-called enlightenment notion discredited by postmodernism. A universal yet context-specific notion of justice is still far more attractive to reclaiming a normative and political progressive domain for development studies in general and sociology of development in particular than any postmodernist inspired attempt in that direction. The very essence of development studies is a normative preoccupation with the poor, marginalized and exploited people in the less developed countries, and in this sense inequality rather than diversity or difference should be the main focus of development studies in general and sociology of development in particular. When I say inequality assumes greater significance in contradistinction with diversity or difference, I mean inequality of access to power, inequality of access to resources, inequality of access to a human existence, and in short, inequality of emancipation. There is no doubt that there is a diversity in forms, experiences and strategies for coping with inequality, which deserves to be an integral part of the domain of development studies. And there is also no doubt that globalization has contributed and would continue to contribute to new forms of inequality and new forms of resistance. Nevertheless, it is inequality as such which should constitute the main focus within the explication of development studies, according to Surman. It is claimed that more attention to diversity and therefore a less essentialist approach to reality leads to more tolerance. That might be so, but tolerance is not necessarily the same as international solidarity. Tolerance is something else than the humanist tradition within development studies with its deep roots in the Enlightenment project. There is only a very thin line between tolerance in the sense of accepting diversity, but you will also find that tolerance, when I said there is a very thin line between tolerance in the sense of accepting diversity on the one hand and cultural relativism on the other, where we tolerate each other but have nothing to say to each other anymore. If the shift from the emphasis on inequality to the emphasis on difference and diversity were to the end of international solidarity, that would be something deeply to be regretted, according to Franz J. Surman. Coming to the point of progress versus risk management, the solution to underdevelopment as opposed by many of the authors in the postmodern anti-modernist tradition, look at the works of Derrida, Foucault and others, that is often astonishingly naive in its simplicity, that is, let the poor in the third world forget about needs which resemble our own needs, according to Surman. Let them forget about wanting a standard of living which the developed countries have. Let them forget about wanting a decent house, access to health care, employment and so on, because these needs draw them into the development process with all its implied negative connotations. Taking this to its ultimate conclusion, visions arise of former development workers who, after first having been deprogrammed and then reprogrammed with the proper attitude, re-enter the field in order to help the poor in the third world to forget about the first world needs. At the very moment that the scarcity of nature as a resource is being internationally accepted, though slowly, the circle of anti-modernist, post-development, non-development authors advises us to forget about the whole notion of scarcity because it forms part of a strategy to impose capitalist logic on those who do not need it. And more concretely, the third world's poor are advised to disengage from the market and to try to trade through other channels to organize their own education, not to use Western medicines, no more artificial fertilizers or pesticides, just intercropping, and not to set unlimited goals if you have limited means. That is why we have discussed in the context of the differences between Marxism and non-Marxism and neo-Marxism, that neo-Marxists argued that our natural resources are limited, scarce in nature, that is why we must have ecological consciousness, environmental consciousness, we must keep something for our future generations. having significant implications for the questions of sustainable development. And for Marxists, what is scarcity? Scarcity is a bourgeois invention for legitimizing inequality. Okay, that is the capitalist logic. Okay. Surman, for example, has strong impression, though judging from the messages conveyed by many a social movement in the third world, that peasants and indigenous people in the less developed countries are often strongly interested in getting the prices right for their products and having access to bilingual education, electricity, transportation and adequate health care. In fact, many social movements and grassroots organizations in the less developed countries demand from their governments to be included in the development process and not treated anymore as second class citizens. Many NGOs, many non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations and so on in the less developed countries as well as in the developed countries support these groups in their justified claims for full citizenship and political participation. Hunger, high morbidity and mortality rates in the third world do not just disappear merely by changing the subjective perspective of the people involved. Further, the concept of risk society is not uncontested with respect to its value for developed countries, let alone its relevance to the poor, the underdeveloped countries. For example, Frank Furedi of the University of Kent is one of the concerned progressive scholars who takes the concepts of reflexive modernization and risk consciousness to task. First, Furedi criticizes the idea that global risk is something new. That is one of the side effects or perhaps even one of the constitutive characteristics of the post-Fordist globalization phase. Furedi denounces this as a pretty ethnocentric and ahistorical view, as he points out the risks which colonized people forcefully had to undergo because of the expansion of Western capitalism as a mode of production. As far as these indigenous peoples are concerned, theirs has been a risk society since the penetration of colonialism. Secondly, it seems very opportunistic to Furedi, according to Surman, to come up with a concept like global risk society just at the moment where the risks which the developed countries have always been able to export to the underdeveloped countries now also threaten the industrialized nation states. Furedi's third objection is that the concept of risk society invokes the image of risks being evenly spread. Pointing towards the global dimensions of risks does not take away the fact that certain nations or more specifically certain categories of people are more risk prone than others. Risk is unequally distributed geographically and sociologically, and thinking otherwise draws away attention from the necessity of emancipatory projects directed at the global underclasses. And finally, the concept of risk society underrates the power of human agency and overrates the apparent autonomous dynamic of technology, which would lead us unequivocally towards the apocalypse. In relation to such objection, this means that collective social action to fight the unequal distribution of risk could be considered useless because social change can only be a consequence of technological developments. So, in a risk society, we are doomed to keep on running from one panic to the next, and collective emancipatory projects are relegated to the margin of the broader global picture. A new morality based on self-restraint is put forward by the adherents of the risk society. Nevertheless, it does not seem likely that risk management through self-restraint is a more powerful beckoning perspective for the poor in the third world than the notion of progress according to Franz J. Surman. Having entered, as we have already entered the 21st century, the notion of progress seems to have lost much of its hegemonic status within development studies in general and sociology of development in particular. Alternative views nevertheless have not been able to reconstruct the paradigm theory practice chain in a broadly accepted way in the same manner as the concept of progress did, nor have they incorporated it within development studies in general and sociology of development in particular. Coming to the third parameter through which Franz J. Surman was trying to look at paradigms regained, that is the state versus civil society. The central role of the nascent state has become de-emphasized in favor of civil society, local government, or a combination of both. Where national states in third world countries have failed to institutionalize democracy and start a decent economic development, local government is now supposed to be able to do just that in a synergetic collaboration with actors from within civil society and with representatives of national and international capital. Good governance these days is no longer associated with the old image of a welfare state, but with new forms of local synergy between economic, political and cultural actors. It is highly interesting to observe how developments within the economic, political and cultural sciences reflect the move away from the central role of the nascent state. For example, in the economic sciences, we see the rapidly increasing interest in economic sociology, that is the idea that economic logic has more sociocultural roots than thought of. In the political sciences, you will find that emphasis is increasingly placed on local government, and in cultural studies or cultural sciences there is a concentration on new hybrid forms of identity construction, and many of these new developments come together in the study of civil society. Also, national and international development projects tend to concentrate ever more on fortifying the role of civil society. Surman argues on three issues, namely the notion implied by globalization concerning the retreat of the state, 1. 2. The potential emancipatory role of local government, and 3. The significance of civil society. In a lucid article about the historical phases of globalization, Dept Nair in 1997 finds it naive to write off nation states as important players in the globalization game, despite the fact that in the imperial phase of globalization, nation states played a more important economic and political role within or rather within development studies than currently. Nation states, as Dept Nair argues, still remain important in political and strategic terms. In his view, it was the military strength of the imperial powers at the time which used to set the rules of the game, in contrast to the present day where it is the political clout of nation states to back up the rules imposed by the transnational corporations, the banks and so on. Here Nair stands in contrast to someone like Martin Shaw, who thinks that military strength still defines the relations between states, and hence the parameters of the world system of power, and that the notion of undermining of nation states is in an age of globalization has focused too much on the economic cultural definitions of nation states. Rajni Kothari, for example, takes up a position in the middle when he puts forward the idea that the new framework of capitalism is based on a transition from the politico-military model of international management and domination, that is the phase of imperialism, to techno-financial system of global as distinct from international integration into an overarching world market, and this leads to the erosion of a state-based structure of national and international interactions. It does not seem logical, for example, to Rajni Kothari to see the shift of power base from the politico-military to the techno-financial as an indication of the weakness of the state. On the contrary, Rajni Kothari sees it as a more subtle form of control. In other words, the definition of the state should be updated. Deepak Nair, Martin Shaw, Rajni Kothari, they all took a line of reasoning which positioned the nation state above all as a result of the special spread or concentration of trade and investment. Janat Skold takes a different point of view. He defines globalization as the super territorial dimension of social life, and subsequently discusses globalization in terms of the nature of collective identity, because for Skolt at least identity is crucial in social relations. According to Skolt then, before the onslaught of the nation state in the 19th century, the social relations were heavily focused on the immediate territorial place. However, after the mid 19th century, the nationality principle became dominant in the identity construction. This at the same time meant the suppression of all those alternative forms of identities which were based on different dimensions such as regional or religious and so on, suppressed dimensions which now in the global era start blossoming again with sometimes disastrous consequences, maybe ethnic strifes in Africa, nationalist secessions in the Balkans, religious fundamentalism in Northern Africa, Algeria, in fact pre-modern forms of identity rising in a global era. And in this context, the important question which Skolt brings up is whether these pre-modern forms of identity are a temporary anachronism emerging in an era where global capitalism and modernity are reconstructing themselves and temporarily creating ideological vacuums because of the end of the Cold War. Cold War, I mean the tension between the capitalist world led by the United States of America and the socialist world led by the erstwhile Soviet Union on the other, and insecurity and so on, or whether they are the heralds of a new type of strategy of emancipation in a global era. According to Skoll, much of present day capitalism is still bound up with national forms, national currencies and national markets. Also, ethnic strifes and indigenous movements tend to reproduce nationhood at a similar scale. So, as Skolt concludes, globalization also goes hand in hand with renationalization. Okay? This is important. When I say globalization also goes hand in hand with renationalization, I mean globalization is not about eliminating nations, only about complicating the construction of collective identities leading to hybridization, and as such Skolt proclaims globalization a core feature of late modernity. So, all in all, there is reason to there is little reason to suppose that the role of the state came to an end because of globalization. Okay? That is why globalization will end the debate of the role of the debate on the role of the state is being negated by Surman. By the same token, the issue of local government must be handled with care. By this, I mean it must be realized that the idea of local government is a decidedly Western notion which is intimately tied to the history of capitalism in the West, reaching its post-Fordist phase from the middle of the 1970s onwards, during which the role of the state was increasingly seen as a hindrance to economic development. Now that many third world countries are currently in a transition phase to democracy, the notions of local government and local autonomy are fed into the national political rhetoric and often used as such in facade politics. It is often conveniently forgotten, for example, that ideas like local government or local autonomy presuppose a phase of nation building first, where a civil society is formally constructed. Also, there was a phase of welfare capitalism during which the state provided a safety net for those who threatened to fall outside the boat. Now, local governments in the third world run the risk of falling prey to globally organized capitalism because their economic and political safety nets have not yet been constructed, and their civil societies are weak, not having been preceded by a process of nation building nor by a phase of welfare capitalism. It is tragic that at the moment that many third world countries are finally starting to get rid of undemocratic regimes, the national state is robbed of its importance. Can the responsibility for human emancipation be removed from the state towards civil society? These are the questions that Surman poses. Can the paradigmatic role of the state be placed by that civil society? Communitarians like Amitai Etzioni certainly seem to think so for the developed world in any case. An important point to be made is that the notion of civil society is highly reified. It is presented as a kind of actor with enough agency to engage itself in a synergetic relation with local government. Surman here does not want to draw us to discussion about the ins and outs of the concept of civil society. What is important to note is that in the context of development studies in general and sociology of development in particular, the concept of civil society is already politically translated into projects to support the transition to democracy in former war-torn countries like Guatemala, former non-democratic regimes in like South Africa and so on. Nevertheless, the enthusiasm with which civil society has been embraced as a new paradigm has not been matched by an elaboration of its theoretical dimensions. A focal point, if you look at a focal point in the attempts to give civil society hands and feet seems to be the notion of social capital. According to Robert Putnam, for example, and Francis Fukuyama, the construction of civil society, the construction of a civil society with the right kind of social capital is a highly historic path dependent process. I mean, right kind, when he mentioned, he was referring to democracy and economic development, both of them. I mean, Robert Putnam as well as Francis Fukuyama. If these authors are correct, we can question, I mean, if both Robert Putnam as well as Francis Fukuyama are correct, then we can question the current attempts to help third world countries construct a civil society with the right kind of social capital. That right kind of social capital which includes democracy and economic development. In any case, it would be highly premature for development studies in general and sociology of development in particular to replace the paradigmatic importance of the state by that of civil society. All in all, how Surman tries to wind up the discussion here, and by looking forward to development studies in general and sociology of development in particular in the years to come, that all in all development studies in general and sociology of development in particular as a typical post-Second World War branch of social sciences has experienced its share of criticisms of its central paradigms. What were those central paradigms? I mean, we have discussed essentializing the third world and its inhabitants as homogeneous entities, the unconditional belief in the concept of progress and in the makeability of our economy, our culture, our polity and so on. And thirdly, the importance of the nation state as an analytical frame of reference and a political and scientific confidence in the role of the state to realize progress. And this is how Surman tries to look at, or the Surman tries to sum up, that development studies in general and sociology of development in particular, as a typical post-Second World War branch of social sciences, has experienced its share of criticisms of its central paradigms. Better put, it received more than its share because of its normative and interdisciplinary character. Some of these paradigms seem to have been lost for good, and from the mid 1980s onwards, the contours of what became known as an impasse in development studies became clearly visible, wherein in the decades to follow, the concept of globalization swept through academia and policy making institutions. It became clear that development studies would probably not make it as such, perhaps after 50 years. Okay, its proposed replacement, that is global studies, was already beckoning. Still, development studies has crossed the millennium threshold, though admittedly not with a gracious jump. I hope from here that as the learners there, that what I have been trying to do, I have been trying to look at where the criticisms of the central paradigms of development studies came from, and that alternative paradigms are either absent or less attractive from the point of view of emancipation. And this does not imply that development studies should totally cast aside these criticisms. The challenge for development studies is to re-establish its continued relevance to study and to understand processes of exclusion, emancipation and development, not particularly by clinging to its once treasured paradigms, but by incorporating creatively different versions of progress, different models of different paradigms of development, without giving up on its normative basis, because normative basis is extremely important. What should be, what should not be, okay, what should be, what ought to be. These are very important questions in research, in policy making and so on. That is the awareness that only with a universal morality of justice is there a future for humanity, according to Surman. Then what we have discussed in this lecture, we have discussed Surman's reflections on paradigms regained in terms of diversity and diversity versus inequality, progress versus risk management, and state versus civil society. Okay, we have discussed Surman's reflections on development studies, and maybe a future possibility is global studies or maybe inequality studies, right? That is why when we look at this for a third world country like India, okay, perhaps we must go ahead with inequality studies. Okay, maybe. Okay, inequality cannot be reduced to only economic inequality. Of course, economic inequality is extremely important. Economic inequality, political inequality, cultural inequality, caste inequality, gender inequality, cultural inequality, the inequality of various forms, right? Okay, inequality not simply in terms of distributive inequality, but also cognitive inequality. Okay? Once C. Viswanathan suggested, why do we always look at distributive justice but cognitive justice? I am borrowing this term from C. Viswanathan, that cognitive justice, I am putting this as cognitive inequality. Not simply inequality cannot be reduced to only in terms of distribution, but also cognition. Okay? In this way, we are coming to the closure of this course. I am sure all of you will be able to take note of this course, enjoy this course. Similarly, you should be focused on what is being discussed throughout these 30 hours of lectures, and this is going to be very important for students drawn from social sciences in particular and humanities and social sciences in general. Even the students from sciences and engineering, they can also opt for this, but broadly social sciences students drawn from philosophy, economics, sociology, political science, geography, archaeology, history, literature, linguistics, anthropology, and so on. It is extremely important to look at sociology of development, and with these 30 lectures we have come to the closure of this course. I wish you all the best in your future endeavors. Thank you. Thanks to all of you.